Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here and for wake up in time. And so we'll have Marcus Goldstein first presenting his paper.
I got it. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you all for coming at 8:30 in the morning. Hopefully I can wake you up with some interesting results, but if not, feel free to go back to sleep. So today I'm going to talk about different kinds of skills for entrepreneurial growth. This is joint work with a large team of people whose names are there. So I want to spend more time than usual on motivation. So the first piece of motivation is a question of whether small firms are very important in developing countries, really small and tiny firms. And I think there's a big question that a lot of people discuss is whether they can be a source of growth. And Togo, which is the country I'm going to talk about today, it's very prevalent. Okay, and Togo is a very poor country. The second is when we think about firms, there's some nice work by DeMel and Company and Bloom and Van Reenen, which shows that there's a link between skills, managerial and entrepreneurial skills, and the productivity of firms. Now, how do we get people those skills? There, the answer is less clear. So there's a bunch of papers and a nice review by McKinsey and Woodruff, which basically show that people sometimes people will come to the training, they will learn what you teach them, and they will apply it, right? I think that's fairly well established. What's less clear is whether that actually does anything for their business, all right? And so the questions that leaves us with is, are we teaching the wrong skills? Are we teaching them to the wrong people? Is the training poorly designed? But also, if you read McKinsey and Woodruff carefully, the question is whether these evaluations had enough power to pick up reasonable effect sizes. So hopefully today we're going to have a paper which answers at least two of those questions. The third part of the motivation is the importance of non-cognitive skills. So Heckman has a paper looking at these and how they matter for outcomes in the US. And there's a line in there which sort of says the returns to non-cognitive skills are significantly higher for women. And that's it, no discussion. So just to sort of leave that thought there. There's other work which sort of shows that they matter more for, Pedro Carnero has this nice paper showing that they matter more for poorer people in developing countries. And then sort of when we think about financial problems, Kunin and Meltzer have a paper showing that they matter there. Okay, so non-cognitive skills matter for income, matter for entrepreneurship. The psychologists have been talking about that for a while, and they matter for poor people. All right, so this is part of a larger project, and it's still in progress. So the questions I'm going to talk about today is what's the effects of different kinds of business training on micro, small, medium enterprise performance and survival. And I'm going to talk a bit about the mechanisms through which that training seems to be working. So the intervention is a training program for 1,000 entrepreneurs in Togo, mostly in Lomé, which is the capital. They're fairly small firms. I'll show you some summary stats in a minute. And what we're going to do is compare two kinds of training, which are randomly allocated. 500 are going to get a World Bank product, which is the Business Edge training, which is, I think the way to think of it is more standard business training. It's hopefully a little better than the standard, but sort of standard. And then the second group is going to get this personal initiative training, which was developed by a psychologist. And they're going to get the same amount of classroom interaction with some follow-up by the trainers. So this Business Edge training, like I said, it's fairly standard. They do a bunch of assessments to see what people need, and then they have sort of 5 themes that they decided were important in Togo, which are sort of along the usual lines: accounting and financial management, negotiation, HR management, and the like. Personal initiative training, hopefully the slide conveys that it's not your standard training. It will turn you into a track star, apparently. But the idea here really is to change the mindset of entrepreneurs. And it focuses a lot on what self-starting behavior looks like, right? So one of the exercises is you sit down with a partner who's another entrepreneur, and you identify in the behavior you saw yesterday and the behavior you did yesterday, what was self-starting behavior, what wasn't. So they learn the concept, they learn to look for models, and they learn to think about it in themselves. And it sort of goes through a range of different characteristics. All right, for our evaluation, we started with the baseline in October 2013, then the training happened, and then there are 4 follow-ups which basically cover 2 years post-training. This is a project with David McKinsey, so we're, of course, practicing the multiple follow-up. Okay, so what do the participants look like? They have average sales about $1,500 per month, profits around 10% of that. The average firm has 2.8 employees and has been in business for 12 years. Trust me, balance is good. Okay, so what we're doing is in these different data rounds, we're collecting a range of data, including psychological outcomes, because part of the team is psychologists, so they're looking at the trajectory of different personality, what economists tend to call personality traits, but psychologists don't, so personality aspects. The results I'm presenting today are preliminary. We're just in the midst of analyzing the round 4 data, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the gender disaggregated results. Those are still in the round 3 analysis. Okay, our methodology, we're doing ITT estimates using ANCOVA. Some of our variables don't have a baseline because there were certain things that appeared to be interesting as we went along, so in those cases we're just doing a post-estimation stratification standard errors. All right, results. So both trainings improve business practices. These are all significant. And here you can see a range of different business practices. The Business Edge, your standard training, increased record keeping significantly more, which makes sense. That's a focus. I think what surprises me is that the personal initiative seems to have had equal effects on practices. When we move on to capital and labor inputs, here we start to see a bit of a difference emerge. So here, these are indices of our capital and labor and capital variables. In the aggregate index there on the left, significantly higher impacts for the personal initiative training. And it seems to be driven by the number of large investments, or the value of large investments, and the number of workers. When we look at the capital, again, significant impacts from both kinds of training. Access to finance, here we have, they're both equal in terms of the effects they're delivering, and they're significant in 3 of the 4 cases. This is just some of the variables in terms of borrowing and the recent loans received. What's interesting, which is going to be a subject of a later paper, is that the amount of loans received is really being driven by increased credit among women. And we're still trying to understand what's going on there. It's quite large. All right, now we're getting into the second order mechanisms. And so the psychologists on our team are really taking a look at the trajectory of certain personality skills or non-cognitive skills. So there seems to be some movement in being proactive and being future-oriented, also in terms of learning from mistakes and handling their consequences. And then they're seeing an increase also, they're telling us, in passion for entrepreneurship and planning, right? So there's future orientation and sort of dealing with problems better. So then it's not a big surprise when we see a significant increase in innovation coming from both trainings. The personal initiative has, across all the different measures, the personal initiative training is having, in that index, is having a significantly higher effect on innovation. And you can, just to give you a taste of it, I think one of the variables that's quite important is the introduction of new products or services, where personal initiative is higher. So more innovation, higher in that personal initiative training. Okay, profits. So this is when we look at our profit and sales index, we're seeing significantly higher effects coming from the personal initiative training. The average effect is a 31% increase in profits when we pool all 4 rounds. We're not getting significant differences across the rounds, so we pool them. So sustained for 2 years. Here you can see the time path. There was anyone want to guess which year the election was in Togo? Can guess from that graph. But significantly higher profits coming from that personal initiative training. All right, so to wrap up, the literature has shown mixed, at best, results for training for small firms and probably less exciting for female entrepreneurs. Also mixed, and different. So our results here are showing there's this profit effect, and it seems to be coming, or one factor that seems to be important, and this is where we're still working on the analysis, is this increase in innovation, which seems to be associated with changes in non-cognitive skills. In the gender differences, what we're getting so far is there's no significant difference across men and women. Male firms have a variance that is 10 times that of female firms, which makes the profits at baseline are equal. But that makes finding any difference between men and women hard. When we asked, so the other thing we structured this to do was to ask the question, if I'm going to do a training for a female entrepreneur, which one's better? And the answer to that is clearly the personal initiative training. So within women, the personal initiative training dominates in a whole range of outcomes, including profits, the business edge. So we're doing more to understand the gender differences, particularly in the psychological realm, and as well as the economic outcome, and then also understanding, also for men, what kind of mechanisms are going on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to discuss this paper, which I really liked. I think it's a great contribution. It's a great contribution in the sense because first, there is not that many papers showing positive impact on profits in this context. And so it was a bit depressing looking at the literature before this paper and seeing all these papers showing all the at most mixed evidence on the impact on business training. So there was really this idea that all the business training effort that was done by a lot of organizations were not really working. And so here they're really trying like a new approach, which is great, and they're finding significant results on final outcomes, which is even very good news. And this impact seems to be driven by innovation. So that's, and I think I'm not going to talk a lot about the impact on women, but I think it's very promising to look into these questions. So my first comment, and I think it is related to external validity clearly, and I think in your introduction you were speaking about the fact that you have all these small firms in Africa, and I'm not sure in your context you're really targeting very small firms. So the paper I'm going to show later, we did like a listing exercise in Cotonou, so it's not very far, and the average firm is about one employee. So here you have like clearly, I think, bigger firms. So it will be very important, I think, to really explain the selection mechanism and why, like, some particular firms select into your program, and to discuss whether this type of approach, innovative approach on non-cognitive skills, could work on the very small business entities. So that's my first comment. On the mechanisms, I think it's really great that you can really go into the mechanisms and explain why this personality skill was more effective. And I think it will be great to try to go a little bit inside the mechanisms of whether it's really the soft skills that improve that, or whether most of the impact is coming from other stuff. In particular, because it seems that a lot of things are driven by innovation and investment. And so maybe one question you want to answer is whether the personality training is really about soft skill, or it's more about innovation and investment. And so maybe the message is training should focus on investment and innovation instead of the traditional management skills. And also it makes me ask, what explains the large impact on access to finance? So here, when I look at the paper, I think one possible effect could be the fact that just being selected for the training could act as a signal for getting a loan. And so I think you may want to try to investigate this idea a bit more, to just be able to say whether this is this signaling effect of the training, or whether it's more like by themselves firms who are able to get access to credit. And finally, because this is really small firms, I think the aspect on the intra-household relationships aspect of this type of intervention is also important. And often you see that this type of small business entities, they are embedded into household where there are like several other activities, and sometimes several other small firms. So you may want to check whether you have some negative externalities on the other businesses, and whether, like, for example, the increased investment in one business is not driven by these mechanisms. And finally, other few suggestions. Maybe it would be good to show maybe more objective measure on performances. So here you have profit, and profit could be impacted by the training itself. So the reporting of profit could be impacted by the training itself, I mean. So maybe looking at outcomes like more observed outcomes, like the number of employees, could be great. And finally, it would be good to look at the cost, and I will stop that. So what is the cost of this training, and whether it's, so it looks very cost effective when you look at the impact on profit, but it would be good to put some figure on that. Okay, thank you. Do you want to answer, or do you want to take some question in the room?
So I have limited cognitive processing power, so let me take yours. And then we'll take. So thanks for, these are all really great points. And a bunch of them are things we need to work on as we develop, so thank you. I think, so your first point on external validity I think you're right, and one of the questions would be to look at it for smaller firms, and that would be very useful. I mean, the other thing that I think was striking was we had really high take-up. So it was like 84%. I didn't put that slide up, but which for a business training program is on the high end. So part of me also wonders about the external validity, whether there's been enough business, or, you go to Dar es Salaam and everyone's had business training like 3 times already. But Lomé, apparently not. So I think there's a question also of what kind of selection we would get if we brought it to Dar es Salaam, right? Which would be different again. But you're right, we are pulling from not the bottom of the distribution. So the soft skills improving, or was it something else? I think the soft skill, the measures that the psychologists didn't expect. My understanding was that they didn't expect the personality metrics to move. I'm avoiding the use of the word skills because there's a debate in psychology, is what they tell me, between whether they're hardwired or malleable. And so they didn't expect them to move. So these people are they're responding to these questions in a way as if they moved. And so that suggests to me that moved, and those skills we know are correlated with innovation. So it's suggestive, I think, that that's the channel, and we're still working on that chunk of the analysis. The question about being in training as a signal for getting a loan, to me, I kind of buy that it's this increased initiative, because there's no history of these programs in Togo, so that shouldn't be differential across the 2 types of training. And we don't see it in the business edge training. And I think if I remember right, there's a bank account effect from the business edge. So if anything, the business edge, which would make sense coming from the IFC, that they pushed the financial inclusion. And that didn't lead to the getting the loan, which then even makes me think that it's this initiative that comes in. But absolutely, take your points on household are well taken. Objective measure and performance, absolutely. The number of employees does move, particularly for women, in the personal initiative, more so than the business edge. But we're also looking at the variance in the profit measures to see if there's some kind of bookkeeping effect, which would also be something else. And yes, we will do cost effectiveness. It's not very expensive. That's not very precise.
Okay, any questions? Yes. I think you need the microphone.
Hi, I had 2 questions. The first is whether or not you see any networking effect among the entrepreneurs. And the second is whether you can or do look at heterogeneous impacts by either the size of the firm or owner characteristics like age and education.
Marcus, thank you very much. Very much enjoyed the presentation. Quick question on the profits. It's probably also one of the more difficult business outcomes to measure. And obviously you have some issues you've alluded to that you want to go back to, particularly for the male subsample. But I was sort of thinking of profits. One of the, Achilles heel of profit measurement also relates to sector of employment. So you might actually have some interesting results there. In terms of finding maybe issues in profits specifically in how people are reporting, but also as it relates to your outcomes. As it relates to your results and further unpacking the heterogeneity of it. Because I'm not sure, maybe I missed it, but I didn't quite appreciate the sectoral distribution of these businesses, like what types of activities that they're undertaking.
This is working, yeah. Thanks, Marcus. It's very nice to see a treatment that works in this area. And so I'd like to kind of push it further and turn it on its head. Given the previous results, it would be interesting to see, in line with the heterogeneity comment, for whom it doesn't work. Because, okay, I think one of the first dimensions to look at is indeed firm size, but the second one, maybe it would be my first, is those who do not employ anyone, just household firms, which, I mean, there's reasons to believe that they have very little growth potential. And it would be really nice to know that these may need different interventions, or maybe we should not hope that they grow at all. Maybe that's more a survival strategy for people. And then an unfair question, there always has to be one, is it's also in line, I think, with the previous one on the spillovers. Can you shed any light on general equilibrium effects? It may be within the household, but it may be others as well. And this is again in light of the literature, right? We find so little effect, so are we crowding out other startups here?
Maybe do you want to answer this?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, thanks. Those are all good. All right, network effects, yes, there are some. They're not simple, but we're seeing increased interactions, and we're still unpacking which training. And I had a slide on that, but I took it out. So, we haven't done it for round 4 yet. So as of round 3, there may be some gender differences in that. They're definitely doing more interactions, but I think there's also something going on with the business edge training too, and they're meeting more with other entrepreneurs. Heterogeneous effects by age education. So we have a pre-analysis plan, which I really hate, but there's nothing remarkable there. So those were all the age. We do a tenure of the firm, and there's nothing terribly remarkable there. Which, let me just tie that into Peter's question on for whom it doesn't work. So we have this one in Tanzania where tenure mattered a lot, which is why I made it into the pre-analysis plan here, where the training actually hurt young firms and it helped older firms. The average effect is a nice 0, but there's really this dispersion. So yes, we will. I'll try and figure out if anybody is being damaged here or not working. Who are they? I think that's a very interesting question. And yes, looking at the small firms for that. Taleb, the measurement. So there was an interesting paper yesterday where there was an interesting discussion yesterday, I think, in your session on the psychology of measurement. So that's what I was talking with David about last night, and he told me to go to sleep. So I do think trying to understand better the error process. We don't have the truth, right? I mean, he's been trying a range of, he tried RFID tags in Malawi to actually get inventory control, and that didn't work at all. We do the best we can. We have a whole bunch of different profit measures, and I'm showing you the index results. So I think it's fairly consistent however we measure it. There is a sectoral difference. That's why that's my theory on why the male variance is much higher. But controlling for sector, it still holds. So, yeah. So the general equilibrium effects, I think that's a good point. We'll do the best we can on the household size. I'm not terribly worried about market effects. David just has this paper in Kenya where he actually set up the experiment to look for spillovers in the market. He doesn't find anything, which I thought was interesting, because my prior would have been that there might very well be. So the market, this is not a huge sample relative to the enterprises in Lomé. They're fairly spread out. So, but the household question I think both of you have raised is really interesting. So far we haven't found any big household effects, but that's definitely something we need to dig on more.
Is there any other? Yes, I have another question.
It's quite interesting that in the personal initiative training, do people teach how to, the management skill? I mean, if it's not, then it is interesting. Personal initiative training increase management skill, which means that people already know how to improve management, even though they don't, because they lack personal initiative, or maybe they lack in initiating their employees. So two things. One is that maybe the management skill is, people already know management skill, but they lack in motivation. And second is that maybe they know how to do that, but people do not know how to motivate their employees to accept that methodologies. So can you?
So I think, oh, sorry, should I take more than one?
Is there any other questions? Maybe we have time for last one or. Okay.
So the variables we're seeing move are more with the entrepreneur, and they're more in the vein of, it's not so much, I don't think it's so much HR management and motivating your employees. I also don't think they terribly lacked personal initiative before. I think what the psychological results so far, and these are very tentative, because the psychologists are doing their different kind of statistics on analyzing that, which I'm trying to learn. It really suggests that it's this overcoming obstacles and forward planning, both of which are less centrally, the employees are less central to that. And the innovations there are more employees, but that to me is more a growth indicator. The results that are really moving are them introducing new products and this finance angle. And so both of those employees are less part of the story, right? I mean, it could be happening for sure, but the effects we're seeing here in those realms are large. And so that's kind of where I am right now, but it's worth looking at.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, everybody. This is another paper about micro-enterprises or small firms in developing countries. And it's particular looking at the relation between these firms and the wider labor market in a way that might be different to what you're used to be. So, this doesn't work. So, I think it's for this audience, almost not necessary to motivate the importance of why we should look at small firms. Marcus already gave us the importance of small firms in a country like Togo. In a country like Mexico, which is relatively much richer, small firms still employ 50% of all workers. And I'm thinking about employment in two ways. Firstly, there could be entrepreneurs who run, own, operate, and manage a small firm. And by virtue of this are self-employed in the small firm. And there might be indirect employment, or what I call indirect employment, for their employees, the workers they hire. To break this up for Mexico, in Mexico, for the roughly last 10 years, on average there have been something like 40 million employed people. 11 million of them are entrepreneurs. You see that most of them are very small. In fact, 99% have 10 workers or less, including themselves. And this is what I refer to as small firms in the context of this study. Actually, 4 out of 5 don't employ anybody. But by their sheer mass, the remaining 20% still employ some 40% of all wage workers in Mexico. So this is what I refer to as this more than half of the labor market that is employed in small firms. This is looking at the entrepreneur as a firm. However, I think we should also look at the entrepreneur as a worker, particularly because entrepreneurs lack attachment to their firm. So for example, again, in Mexico, the empirical setting of this study, only 70% of entrepreneurs stay on to be entrepreneurs in the next quarter, and most of those who leave take on wage jobs. We also know that micro-enterprises on average don't grow much, despite possibly high returns to capital, which suggests some unexploited returns from investing from growing more. Previous studies have looked at a lot of different determinants of this. Lack of skills or training, as we have just seen from Marcus, can be an important determinant of keeping small firms small. Access to capital could be another one, or recent literature behavioral literature has looked at behavioral biases. In this paper, I'm asking whether this dual role of a firm, of an entrepreneur as a firm and as a worker, is a possible explanation for why firms stay smaller than they otherwise would. Particularly, I hypothesize that the incentives which are created by the rational expectations of entrepreneurs of leaving to better outside opportunities in the future, and these will be wage employment, that these create a channel for underinvestment. That is, that firms would stay smaller than they otherwise would. And I look at this theoretically and empirically. So theoretically, I look at the model of an individual entrepreneur. So I fix everything about the entrepreneur. I fix their productivity, I fix their motivations, I fix the constraints in different kinds of markets. And I look at how these entrepreneurs take different choices if they're embedded in different labor markets for their own labor. In the model, I lay out under what conditions we can expect a non-separation and underinvestment. Empirically, then, I'm looking for a setting that replicates the theoretical setting, that is where there are shocks to a labor market of an entrepreneur, and I take the labor market to be local labor markets in Mexico, and I look at what happens to entrepreneurs when there are job opportunities being created in a very particular sector where I can isolate exogenous variation to the market. And I find that entrepreneurs are attracted into wage work when wage work becomes available in the local market, and they decrease their firm size. And I look at various alternative channels that could potentially also explain these findings. How does that contribute to literature? I think, firstly, the main issue is that we should look at entrepreneurs as firms and as workers, and this is something that can influence firm size and performance. So there's a long literature, both theoretically, older, mostly from the 80s and 90s, and a very active empirical literature that we know about in developing countries that looks at determinants of firm size and performance, and I think this one here is a potentially new determinant. On a micro level, there are studies that look at entrepreneurs as workers in the context of occupational choice, and there's this notion of reluctant entrepreneurs. In this paper, I spell up some further implications of having reluctant entrepreneurs and how they might run their firm differently. On a macro level, there's the notion that uncertainty for firms can contribute to what Xi and Kliman call misallocations, that is, the marginal products across firms are not equalized, and this is something that this model specifically also replicates. And there is a literature on export manufacture and job creation in developing countries, and with the empirical setting, I'm close to that literature. So I want to briefly talk about the model. I'm not going to go too much into details, but want to keep that intuitively. I'll show a number of graphs that convey the essence of the model, and then talk about the empirical application in Mexico. So the setup of the model in the simplest version is straightforward. The model is static. They are entrepreneurs who are risk neutral. They have access to a production technology and capital. I can easily extend it to labor, but for ease of exposition, I only think about capital as a moment as an input. And this capital, they can hire that freely to start with on a competitive market. The non-standard thing is that entrepreneurs are uncertain about the opportunity cost of their own labor at the time of contracting with firm-specific capital on markets. And this uncertainty comes in a particular way, specifically through three assumptions. Firstly, that occupational choice is discrete, that a worker can only be either an entrepreneur or wage employed at the same time. And this is something reasonable in the Mexican cities where 95% of people only hold a single job. So multiple jobs are not very common here. Secondly, that production in a firm only takes place when the owner is self-employed and motivated by a missing market for managerial labor. So the first two assumptions together mean that if a worker takes up a wage job, if an entrepreneur takes up a wage job, then they will have to stop producing in the firm. They can't just hire somebody as a manager to continue production. And finally, there's uncertainty about the wage employment opportunities. Model is a standard search model, so there's a wage offer that arrives with a certain probability, and even when it arrives, it's drawn from a distribution. So there's a twofold uncertainty, whether you get an offer and what it is worth. Entrepreneurs have to make two decisions. They have to make decisions about the inputs on the intensive margin, which is the capital they hire, on the incentive margin, and this is here whether to continue as an entrepreneur or whether to take a wage job. So they decide about capital and they decide about their reservation wage, which is the minimum wage that they would be willing to accept. And maximize their expected utility, which comes from three parts. The first two parts is the expected income in either of the sectors. Either if they stay self-employed, then it's the income, the profits in self-employment, and there's no uncertainty here, so I extract from that uncertainty, I focus on the uncertainty in the labor market. And the second part is the expected wage if they decide to take up a wage job. In any case, entrepreneurs will have to bear the cost of capital. So if you look at this not from the perspective of an entrepreneur, but from a firm, we have a firm that has to pay costs with certainty. Just think about it repaying debt on a capital they hire, but they make profits only in some state of the world, that is when they continue as a firm. Now intuitively, we should discount their returns by this probability of leaving the firm. They will require higher returns to make up for this potential of making zero returns. And this is what happens. So in the optimal firm size, if we take the first order condition of that problem, we find that the marginal product of capital, this pi prime, is not equal to R, the rate of return to capital, which we have in a very standard problem of the firm, but there is a wedge created by the probability of staying, which itself depends on the reservation wage. So you see that this is a function that depends on both sides, on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of capital. And I can show analytically that it's not guaranteed that there will be a unique firm size that entrepreneurs will choose. We could have a setting like the one that I depict here, where there are three possibilities that this equation for optimal firm size is fulfilled, A, B, and C. I provide a dynamic extension of the model where I introduce credit constraints, and there we see that A and C are what we would call dynamically stable equilibria. So in other words, we can create a situation by virtue of the occupational choice channel where there could be a positive equilibrium like A. And there's an equilibrium where the rate of return to capital is much higher than the interest rate. The interest rate is basically at this level here of rates of return. So this is something that replicates this puzzle from the literature. Why would there be unexploited returns? And the main comparative statics that I derive, and this is then what I continue to test, is that better wages or more offers, that is an improvement in opportunities in wage employment, reduce firm size as measured by capital here. But the magnitude may differ. So either we might have a local change in firm size, or we might actually switch equilibria. So to test this comparative static, I ideally have a situation where wage employment opportunities only shift the probability of staying in business, not the profitability or the return to capital itself. And for that, I exploit changes in a very particular sector in the local labor market entrepreneur, and that is in the export manufacturing sector. I go further and I isolate the exogenous component employment changes in export manufacturing in industries in Mexico, which are due to changes in US demand, and US is by far the biggest trading partner of Mexico. So I create a measure which is a predicted change in export manufacturing jobs per 1,000 working age population. And I do that by interacting the initial employment in an industry with aggregate level exports at the industry level. Then I sum it up for all industries in a municipality. So then I have a measure of jobs, a change of jobs in a municipality in a given quarter. And this is what I look at as an explanatory variable in my outcome regressions, where I have the outcome at the level of the individual entrepreneur in a first difference. And I always control for the individual ingredients that go into this measure. The data sources, the main data source is survey data, the Mexican labor force survey. The advantage of that is that I see the firm as an entrepreneur and as a worker. That is, I see transitions of entrepreneurs. For each firm, though, I only know a limited number of variables, which are industry, profits, and the number of paid workers. And the number of paid workers is what I use to express firm size. The data on export manufacturing employment, I obtained that from Social Security records, and I have trade data to construct the predicted employment. Which export manufacturing industries are we talking about? There are 10 industries that have a high share of the output being exported. They come in two flavors. The first is textile industries in different sorts. And the second is more sophisticated heavy machinery industry, electric industry, or particularly car manufacturing, which accounts for a third of all jobs in these industries that I consider. The pay of these jobs is competitive for the self-employed. So here you see the distribution of earnings for the self-employed and in these particular export manufacturing industries, and you see that they overlap quite a lot. So there's this notion that for most of the self-employed, there should be some wage out there that they potentially might accept, but they will not know ex ante whether they will get an offer or not. The results. Firstly, because I use a predictive measure, I just want to reassure you that this predicted isolated measure of exogenous variation in export employment is highly predictive of the actual measure. Now, there are two outcomes I want to show, which constitute a test of the model. The first is, what do entrepreneurs do about their own labor, about their own jobs when export jobs arise? They're more likely to leave the firm when they're faced with such an increase in export jobs in the local market. So there are two outcomes I show. One is the probability of leaving anywhere, just leaving the firm. The other one is leaving to wage employment, which includes export manufacturing employment, also other wage jobs. And we see that if we have a local change in wage employment opportunities, entrepreneurs go into wage employment. This is kind of like a standard thing we should expect of occupational choice. Now, the interesting test for the model I propose is whether entrepreneurs also react with decisions about the firms to these changes in employment opportunities for themselves. Whether they particularly reduce their firm size. There are two measures I show. The first one is absolute firm growth. So whether you change one worker, you change two workers, etc. Now, this, of course, probably a misspecification, because this is very different to if you have no employees to start with, or if you have one or two employees, etc. So you look at another measure which normalizes this firm growth. There's relative firm growth. So if you add one worker, you have one worker beforehand, there's 100% firm growth, etc. And I do find that the local export manufacturing changes significantly reduce the firm size. Now, the question is, could there be alternative mechanisms that drive these results? And I've just briefly discussed two, and it shows some evidence that suggests that they might be not that important, but I think there's more work I need to do on this side here. The first could be product market linkages. So if there are shocks to big firms in your market, it could be that these transmit somehow to small firms in the market. There could be either positive or negative. That depends on basically whether big firms and small firms produce complements or substitutes. There could also be labor market linkages. So if big firms hire, they could also compete for workers with the small firms. And this could be another thing that possibly could explain these effects that we've seen. Firstly, if there are product market linkages, then we should expect the effects to be concentrated in the manufacturing sector. This is not what I find here. So if anything at all, I find bigger and more significant effects in other sectors where small firms operate. For example, in the construction and transfer sector, this is where the effects are the largest, or in the commerce sector, or in the services sector. So that makes sense. I mean, if you think about which kind of like people would counterfactually work in say, a car factory, these are skilled craftsmen who otherwise are working in sectors, for example, such as construction. I also exploit differences in timing. So what I see is that firm growth responds to anticipated job growth, and anticipated means basically over 2 or 3 quarters, so 6 to 9 months before export manufacturing jobs actually are being created. is when entrepreneurs reduce their firm size. This is consistent with the theory that it should be expectation of the probability of leaving that alters the firm size decisions. And indeed, entrepreneurs that leave entrepreneurship actually when they predict that jobs are being created. So, because I'm out of time, let me wrap up. I just want to conclude by summarizing. So I formulate a model of an entrepreneur-run firm that introduces a non-separation between entrepreneurial choices and occupational choices of small firm owners. This creates incentives for keeping firms small. To test this hypothesis, I exploit variation in Mexican export manufacturing that creates such changes in employment opportunities for entrepreneurs. I find that entrepreneurs take up these jobs, reduce their firm size, and it provides some supplementary evidence that this should not be driven by alternative channels, but this is something where more work needs to be done. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay. So a couple of overall comments. This is an epic paper, and I am in awe of Michael for having presented it in 15 minutes, because it's got this really nice model, and it's this serious idea of what's going on with the movement out of these small enterprises into wage work. It really makes us think about the dynamics of the market. And then he has these fairly serious empirics. And he didn't, I noticed he sort of skipped over it on his slides. Thank goodness he didn't take us into the equilibrium model, which is the section that was in progress in the current version. Unfortunately, this paper is increasingly policy relevant given current US policy trends. About shocks that may be coming to the Mexican export market. Okay, so let's start by discussing the model a bit. So one of the key assumptions here is people only do one thing. The Mexican numbers, I think Michael said only 5% do more than one thing. So it's small. So we're doing a project in Ghana with some salaried workers. This is in rural Ghana. I looked at the data yesterday, and 20% of the salaried workers actually do two things. So I think this isn't, it's not Mexico. I'm convinced this is a very small thing. But when I think about sub-Saharan Africa and the stickiness of wages, I think there's probably a fair number who do more than one thing when they have a salaried job. And the other things of business. So I think thinking about that and how that may change things a bit, I don't think it's not fundamentally just, it doesn't undermine the model fundamentally, I think, but it does complicate it. Another thing which I think is just a more interesting point for discussion is this missing market for managerial labor. When you do firm surveys, or when you talk to entrepreneurs in sub-Saharan Africa, you often hear the story of, oh yes, I left the business with my brother and now it's bankrupt. Now, there could be a selection bias because they're telling you, but there is this missing market for managerial labor for small firms, and you kind of wonder why that's the case, and what we could do maybe to make it work better. More generally on this framing, there's a great paper which sort of lurks in the darkness that DeMel, McKenzie, and Woodruff did, and it's called "Who Are the Microenterprise Owners?" Tachman versus De Soto in Sri Lanka. And so what they do is this really weird thing. Maybe that's why that paper doesn't get a lot of traffic. And they sort of classify these really small enterprises into two types. Whether they look a lot like wage workers, so they have data on three pools of people: wage workers, large firms, and these small firms. And then they try and map these folks using biology, statistics, into wage workers or
large firms. And 2.5 years later, they follow them, and 2.5 years later, they're actually a good prediction. And most of the small entrepreneurs, and this sort of lines up behind what Michael was saying, most of them look like wage workers in their characteristics. There is a segment that looks like the large firms, and they do well, but most people aren't. So I think this, I know Michael wants to hold this fixed, and it's probably a good idea for the model, but thinking about the entrepreneurial type and how they update. And over time, you know, who are the pool of people? I mean, there's new entries, so there's always a flow issue. But over time, people should learn their type and sort of, that may adjust how they invest, for example. All right, empirics. Questions, well, the first one was a question, is the trajectory in response to positive shocks the same as negative, or the up and down? Because I think the one that you're focusing on goes up and down. And so do the reactions look the same on both parts of that curve? One thing which I was thinking about while you're talking, I think is relevant, is you're using a predicted independent variable. So I think you need to do errors in variables, which just means you have to adjust you need to back out the reliability ratio and adjust the standard errors. But we can talk about that later, because I'm not totally sure about that. All right, there were a couple puzzles in the tables that I thought were interesting, and maybe you could expand on them. So the employment transitions, like Michael said, they look like the model says they should. But wages are less clear. I think they're interesting, the pattern. So the export jobs go up, and self-employment profits also go up. And there's a bit of discussion of this in the paper. Informal wages also go up. But formal manufacturing wages go down. That's only significant at the 10% level, but it's actually a fairly big coefficient. And there's no significant effect on formal export manufacturing wages. So it seems like the wage signals aren't, to me, behaving perfectly well. Small firm growth. One question I had here is why you're using I know you use the relative growth measure, but 80% of the 80%, it's not clear if that's true for the sample, but a large fraction of the firms employ no workers. So I was wondering about that. And it wasn't clear to me if you're counting the entrepreneur as a worker or not. And then you look, in the investment effects, you look at two different shocks in the paper version I read, and there were different investment effects, which I thought might be interesting to discuss why you thought they were different. That's it.
Thanks very much, Marcus. Yeah, I think that these are all very, very great points. They're all well taken, and things I need to look at. Just one thing I want to respond to is I really like the suggestion about who are the micro-enterprise owners and whether I can classify them according to certain types and see whether that's predictive of whether they actually take up these jobs or not. Yeah, I think that's certainly something I need. There's definitely something new I need to do, and yeah, there's also other great suggestions that I should pick up. So happy to take other questions.
So after Marcus, I guess mine are going to be very superficial. I just had one about the way you model the choice between self-employment and wage work. It's quite counterintuitive because you assume away the risk in the self-employment, and you say, oh, the wage is so uncertain. So what's uncertain is when you get the wage offer. But people really like wage work because once they get it, they think they can keep it forever. And there's not going to be so much uncertainty there. So that's one thing. And the other thing is just maybe in terms of policy or misallocation sort of type of thinking. given credit market imperfection, maybe this is the type of allocation we want, which is people going to capital. And it's very broad.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting, but I think there is something missing because the self-employed, do not make a difference between those who choose fully to be self-employed, to be entrepreneur, compared to those who did it by lack of choice. And we know those who did it by lack of choice, whenever they have an available wage job, they will take it. While those who did choose to be entrepreneur by taking fully into account the risk and the consequences, they will never take a wage work. And here you are focusing on the monetary values of entrepreneurship. And if you do that, you are not taking into account people who choose to be entrepreneurship because of all the benefits which are not monetary. So it was my.
Thank you very much for a really interesting paper. I'm still wondering if you succeed in excluding the possibility of the labor market linkage. So this is what the Melitz model actually predicts. And one thing you can do when we focus on the investment, I'm not sure you did that, but if you assume some functional formula production functions, and then labor market wage increase will actually, because of the relative prices, the capital will not be decreased because of the market labor market wage increase. So if you look, if you still find some decrease in the capital after the shock, then it might be more suggestive.
Okay, shall I respond to these for a moment? Yeah, first question, Clément, thanks very much. The risk in self-employment. That's true. There is risk in self-employment. There are also, in response to the other question, of course, there are many considerations why to be self-employed. I'm focusing one particular channel. Why people change between occupations, and that is basically attractive wage jobs, which I agree they're mostly what they pay is mostly attractive. So it's trying to isolate basically this one channel from other determinants that we have about knowing why people are entrepreneurs or why they're workers. In terms of those who don't fully choose to be self-employed, I think I'm trying to see that in this paper on a continuous scale. So there are opportunities in wage employment for all entrepreneurs. Maybe not for Bill Gates, but for most entrepreneurs, there will be some wage job out there. For some entrepreneurs, most wage jobs would be attractive. So it's kind of like they will have the notion that these entrepreneurs might be kind of like they're not by choice, right? If they would get anything, they would leave. Other entrepreneurs, for those, this is kind of like it is there, but it's not that important. So I'm looking at this at a continuous scale, basically. How important is it, kind of like these outside opportunities for you as an entrepreneur? In the final comment about the Melitz model exactly is one of the alternative channels through an adjustment in wages. Now, I mainly presented here the outcome variables firm size as workers. This is mainly driven by data restrictions. I have some investment data that you mentioned, Marcus, that I didn't talk about, I think is not very great data. The definition has changed over years, so there's a lot of restrictions why you can use that. I'm hoping to get access to much more comprehensive firm data on Mexican firms to be able to speak to this issue of investment directly. And basically, I would like to see that the effects kind of like as seen on labor, they should also be there in investment, and they should be there for most of the people who don't employ anybody to start with. So basically, given more data, this kind of like something I really like to explore. Maybe there's a final thing I want to pick up also from your comments, Marcus, the question of the missing market and whether people can run more than one firm or not. So I don't. These are approximations I don't follow firms over different owners. So that's for these kind of firms, it's not possible basically to see if you left a firm or not. What I can look at is have you started a firm yourself? There's 90% of the people who say they've done so. And I can look at, if I see somebody leaving entrepreneurship, is somebody in their household operating a business in the same sector? Then I can assume as an upper bound, in a sense, kind of like that, this might be the same business. Could, of course, also be different businesses. So I think this is to see whether this assumption is reasonable for most entrepreneurs, and I think it is. It would be great to follow small firms over several owners, but it's not possible with this, or most data indeed.
The farms with larger capital will less likely to exit, so those farms will be less affected. So is that prediction for testing the model? That's gonna be.
It's exactly a prediction, yeah. And that's one I hope to test with data on capital. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about formalization in Benin. So this is a joint work with Najib Benassim, David McKenzie, and Massi Santini at the World Bank. So this paper is about this issue of informality in developing countries. So if you look at informality in developing countries, this is huge. And if you take the example of Benin, you have like 70% of GDP and about 90% of employment that is informal, that is in the informal sector. And so why governments may try to do something with about informality? So the reason is that a high level of informality in the society may carry like different private and public costs. And so for formal firms, it may mean that it's more difficult for them to get access to finance, to get access to government programs, to get access to some markets. For the governments, it may be more difficult to collect taxes, and also it means that they don't have good information on the private sector, and so that it may be more difficult to implement good public policy. And for formal firms, there may be some unfair competition from if informal firms are not paying any tax. And so in the last maybe 10, 15 years, governments around the world implemented a lot of reforms to make it easier for firms to formalize. But this reform had limited success, especially when formalization also means paying taxes. So the existing evidence on the subject suggests first that just simplifying formalization may be not sufficient to reduce informality, and also that and so most firms will stay informal unless they are paid to formalize or they are forced to register. And the other thing suggested by the literature is that the returns to formalization for most firms seems to be small or negative, meaning that the increased tax you have to pay when you become formal is not compensated by the possible other benefits. So, building on this literature, we use the fact that the government in Benin introduced a new legal status called the entrepreneur status, which make it basically free and easy and much easier for firms to register. And so we are using the pilot phase of this new status to try different additional incentives to formalization and to answer to the following questions. First, we want to know, to answer whether, in the context of Benin, since most existing evidence are coming from Asia or from Latin America, we wanted to answer whether, in the context of Benin, just making it easier to formalize could be sufficient to increase formalization. And second, whether if we can increase the net value of being of formalization by increasing the potential benefits of formalization, whether this can change the decision about formalization. And so we are testing that by introducing, by offering to firms, to some firms, in-person information and explanation about the potential benefits of formalization, by also offering to a group of firms some access to business training and some support to open a bank account if they choose to formalize, and also by offering tax mediation services. That is, the idea is to try to make sure they will not pay too much taxes in case of formalization. And finally, of course, we want to know what is the impact of formalization itself on firm outcomes and on formalization together with these additional services. So the main result, we find that simplifying the registration is not sufficient, so that's in line with the literature. We do find that when we start to enhance the benefits of formalization, there is some firms that formalize, and we find like impacts that are significant and higher than what was found in the literature. So firms receiving the full packages of incentives are 16 percentage points more likely to formalize. However, formalization offers limited benefits in terms of better performances, so we don't find impact on final outcomes like profits. And the cost of this type of personalized assistance are high, so it's unlikely to be cost effective. And we do also some work on targeting and find that larger firms and firms that were looking more like formal firms to begin with were more likely to formalize. So formalization in Benin, what do we mean? We mean that first, when you become formal with the new entrepreneur status, it's free of charge and you can do it in one day. You can get some tax exemption in the first years, and you can get access to some other potential benefits, like you can open a bank account, access to public contract. But the important point is also that it has implication in terms of the amount of tax you will have to pay. So if you become formal, you are more likely to pay any tax, and you are more likely to pay a higher share of your profit in tax. And you get this nice card so you can show that you have this legal status to the authorities. So with experimental design, so we did a listing survey of businesses in Cotonou, the capital of Benin, in 2014. And from this survey, we got a sample frame of 3,600 informal firms. So that sample firm is representative of all informal firms with a fixed location in Cotonou. So we excluded all businesses without any fixed location. And so we randomly allocated these firms into 4 groups. The first group received only in-person visits where someone tried to convince the businesses to register and to explain what are the potential benefits of formalization. A second group received the same visit plus access to additional government services like business training programs and possibility to open a bank account. A third group received the same incentives plus the tax mediation services, and the last group is the control group. And we are relying on mainly on monthly administrative data on formalization that were matched with our study data, and on 2 follow-up surveys in 2015 and 16, and we're using also cost data. So just quickly to show you like the characteristic of the firms we are talking about. We see here that these firms are quite small, with in average about 1.2 employees and monthly profit about $80 US dollar. And when we compare these firms to the firms that were also surveyed during our survey, which were formal at this time, we see that like formal businesses are much bigger. The program implementation, so the program was implemented in 3 main steps. The first steps, businesses received the visit of an advisor to try to convince them to formalize and to explain the program. So that was specific by group. And so on that, all businesses that were selected, they actually received this visit. Then the second step is they had to choose whether or not to become formal. And finally, for the businesses who choose to become formal, they have access to the additional incentives. And so you see that the take-up rates of these last steps are quite small, mainly because firms had first to formalize. So when we look at the impact on formalization, so this graph is showing like formalization rates in time after the first visit. To the firms. So you see that the first thing we see here is that in the absence of the program, this type of firms usually don't formalize, as only 2% of the control group ever formalize after 20 months. And that all different types of program had significant impact on formalization. With impact for the group receiving the full package of incentives, which is about 16 percentage points in comparison to the control group. And so this is bigger than what was found in other contexts for similar interventions, but it still means that a large majority of firms will remain informal. One question we had when we saw that was whether like the impact we see in the first group, so the group where we only convince the firms and we did not provide additional incentives. So one question we had is whether it is just information or whether it's the fact that we really convince the firms. So to test that, we did an additional small intervention at the end of the program. So during our endline survey, we just distributed to half of our control group leaflets about the program, and we just gave them just information about the program and the new status and the fact that it's free and easy to register. To just see if information only could have like the same impact, but we don't find the same result. So it means that it was not information only, but it was really like we had to convince the firms for them to become formal, and otherwise just information is not working. Then when we look at the impact of formalization on other outcomes, so we do that by pulling our 2 follow-up surveys together and running panel regressions and instrumenting formalization by assignment to treatment. So the first caveat with that is that given the low take-up, we don't have a lot of statistical power to look at the impact on formalization itself on other outcomes. However, we do find some impact on some intermediate outcomes, like firms are more likely to do some accounting or less likely to suffer from tax harassment. However, we don't find impact on profits, or firms are not more likely to access business bank account or loan financing. They do not get more customers, and and we don't find impact on final outcomes like profits or standard of living. When we look at costs, so the costs were quite high for these interventions. So per treated firms, it was about between $100 to $300 per firms. And if you divide that by the impact on formalization, the cost per formalization is very high. So if you compare to the baseline monthly profit, it means that probably it's not going to be cost effective. We try to investigate why more firms did not formalize, and we find 2 main reasons. One is other legal barriers, and the fact that a lot of firms don't have legal IDs. A lot of firm owners don't have legal IDs, so that could be a barrier because it means they had first to get an ID and then to be able to register their firms. And also, we think that for many of these firms, they are maybe very far from the formalization margin, so they were not interested at all by the program. And we see that in particular because after 2 years, like when we asked them in the treatment group, so the firms that received the visits, we asked them to explain us what was the entrepreneur status. Only 25% of them were able to explain that. So it means that for these firms, maybe it's not a very relevant issue, that formalization is not first order issue for them. We do some heterogeneous analysis, and what we try to do is to look at so before we collected any endline data. So only using our baseline data, we tried to, because we had data on both formal firms and informal firms at baseline, we were able to just run regressions to try to predict which type of firms are informal but have similar characteristics than formal firms. And we were able to classify about 20% of firms in our sample as looking like formal firms. And when we look at the impact on these firms, you see that the treatment effects are much bigger. So that's maybe a promising way to improve the cost effectiveness of the program by doing much more targeting. And so to conclude, I think that here we find results that are mainly consistent with the literature, in the sense that we show that simplifying the registration system is not sufficient, and that but we do find some significant impacts, meaning that there is a demand for formalization for at least some firms. We don't find a significant impact on performances, so this program was not likely to be cost effective, which means that we need to test cheaper ways of implementing this program, in particular by implementing, and that better targeting is needed. So one good aspect of this program is that we took a very representative sample of informal firms, but the downside is that most of these firms don't seem to be interested by formalization. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor, for this presentation of a very, very interesting paper. I think this is an extremely well-documented intervention that is transparent about all the different steps taken, in a sense, a causal chain that could go from the information treatment to ultimate outcomes, the benefits of formalization. In the presentation, of course, you kind of looked at the main points, but in paper I could really get a feeling of every bit of this step along this chain. Which basically is some 4 steps, right? You have the intervention, and it's a take-up, i.e. are people listening to the information? Do they take up what's being offered through the information? And what does it have an effect on ultimate intermediate and then ultimate firm outcomes that we care about, the benefits of formalization? I mean, you find basically there are not many of them. But some firms do seem to take up. So I think with that, what this paper really is very valuable is that we have a unique chance to examine whether there are actually benefits to formalization. Usually papers don't have that because firms don't formalize. In your context, some of them did. And I think this is really an assumption that there are benefits to firms about formalization. It's sometimes maybe a bit a weird assumption to think that firms are being taxed. That's something we typically think of as a cost. Now, could there basically be a win-win situation that there are also benefits? I think there's a question: is the glass half full and half empty? In my comments, I play the devil's advocate and say the glass is totally empty. So this is how you should take these comments, right? I provide a story of I think what I see in the results here, where the glass is empty. So the first question is what the intervention does. Does it enhance the benefits of formalization themselves, or does it enhance the gimmicks? Does it enhance the supplementary good things that it gave to firms? So again, being the devil's advocate, let me take that to an extreme. This is an advertisement by a bank in the UK, the Marks and Spencer Bank. If you open a free current account with them, you get a £170 gift card when you switch and stay. Now suppose I don't have a current account and you're interested in looking I'm not banked at all. What's the effect of being banked for me if I take up this current account? And then you find that I spent £200 more on Marks and Spencer. So the question is that an effect of basically me having a current account, or is it an effect of me taking up this particular treatment where I also get a gift voucher that I then spend? So again, this is taken to the extreme, but I think there's some analogy to what is in your findings here. So there are two packages that firms get. Basically, the first one is you get a free registration, and then you get a 3-year tax reduction. And additionally, you might get that plus some business training, plus a cheap bank account being basically offered to you. I mean, you're being made aware of that, but most other people are not aware, I think, of these possibilities. And what the effects are is that, well, some firms register, they pay less taxes, and they face less tax harassment. Well, I'm not entirely sure. I think I would like to know more what the tax harassment exactly means. And the firms who are offered the additional perks, they take up more registration, and they take up some of these perks, business training. I think there's no really effect on taking up a bank account. So I think being the devil's advocate, I wonder, are these immediate consequences of actually formalization, or the consequences of the particular things which are offered, the gimmicks, in a sense, that come with formalization to the firms in this context here? And that relates me to the question, is formalization a good thing? I mean, for the government, clearly it is, right? In terms of welfare analysis, clearly the potential tax benefits are why governments really directly care about formalization. I think in the context of your paper, I'd also be interested to see how much could these tax benefits be over maybe a longer period, over a lifetime of an entrepreneur, because the costs are quite substantial. I mean, this is a very intensive treatment. It's highly qualified people who go to individual firms and explain them the benefits and the package which is being offered, and it's very expensive. Of course, beyond the direct benefits, there are important externalities, right? In your paper, say, the government is interested in creating a culture of legality, such that if we're in a situation where everybody pays their taxes, it's much easier to sustain that as an equilibrium. So, formalization is a good thing for the government and probably also for a social planner, but is it a good thing for the firms? And here I think my reading of the results is not really, right? I mean, if you want to make firms to pay their taxes, in a sense, well, you have to force them to pay their taxes. The question is it naturally something in the interest for the firms as well to register for this? And I think some bits of your paper that I read as evidence that firms seem to know ultimately there are not many benefits. And the most common response in the control firm why they wouldn't formalize is they didn't see any benefits, or they just saw the costs that is paying the taxes. Also, that's one of the reasons I think I really like that you detail these different steps that you've taken is that firms are visited twice. Basically, everybody took the information on the first visit, but on the second visit, half of the firms said, I'm no longer interested. I've heard that. I'm no longer interested in hearing again about this. But the firms who do take up, especially in the treatment arms that offer these supplementary benefits, most of them actually go for these extra benefits. So that, I think, it suggests for me that this is what really what drives these what you call intermediate outcomes. And I think where I would go as far as interpreting that there are no results. But this is, of course, something up for discussion. So I offered a particular view of the findings. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Okay, I'm going to answer first to this. Thank you very much. This is very interesting feedback. And I think, really we need to think a bit more about what to do with the result, and on the aspect of whether we are really testing formalization alone or formalization together with other stuff. I think, you're totally right. We are testing formalization together with the additional incentives. And in fact, the only groups for which we kind of have the test of pure formalization because we are not providing additional incentive is for the group 1. But we don't have a lot of firms in this group, so it's kind of difficult to see things for this group. And but yeah, I think we decided to do that because of the literature that was showing that formalization alone had no effect on all of other outcomes. So I think our research question here is really to see whether we can try to boost the theoretical like potential benefits of formalization. And so that's what we tried by providing these additional incentives. And so in a sense, if you think that formalization has no impact, here we were really trying to see that maybe together with this additional incentive, it could have an impact. So it was, I agree that it's not really a pure test of formalization itself, but formalizations together with like the current perceived potential benefits of formalization. In terms of the benefits on tax harassment, we try to look at different measures of tax harassment, whether they are paying bribes, whether they are satisfied with the amount of tax they are paying. But of course, it's true that it may be just the fact that they are paying less taxes, so they feel that they are less harassed, and not necessarily other like stuff like more harassment in the sense of the tax inspector coming and harassing you to pay more tax or paying bribes. But one interesting thing on tax harassment is that in theory, when we designed the program, only the groups receiving the additional incentive were supposed to have this tax cut for themselves, and also this tax mediation services was only supposed to be for the third group. But what we find is that all groups manage to get access to these benefits in terms of lower tax harassment. So we also see lower tax harassment in the first groups, which was not supposed to receive anything on that. And also which was not supposed to receive the tax cut in the first years. So in a way it means that they managed to get, with the formalization, they managed to get by themselves this lower tax harassment. So I think that's an interesting result in itself. I'm going to stop there and maybe ask for some questions.
Mean to be always the maybe one potential response to Michael's comments is to look at outcomes that are not directly related to interaction with. So the tax harassment thing seems to be like a bit problematic from that perspective. But the bank account, so that seems to be, the bank here seems to be a third party. So the question is whether the bank care about whether the firm is formal or not, to what extent they do, and just looking at the tables that I think you didn't have time to present, it looks like you do have a joint effect. So you have little power, so maybe comparing one group to the next is problematic, and maybe it's about gimmicks, whatever. Maybe we have, just in terms of benefits of formalization, we do seem to have an effect on the probability to open a bank account. Is that right?
Sorry, on what?
We do seem to have effects there on the probability, maybe not to have a bank account, but to get a loan from the bank. You do see, just to make sure there's a benefit. No? Okay.
No, we do see some take-up on the number of firms that are taking the entrepreneur official bank account.
Yeah.
But in the control group, they are also taking another bank account. So we don't find impact on...
But on the loan taking, for example?
And on the loan, we don't see anything.
I see a joint coefficient, the test of joint significance of the coefficient.
In the paper or?
Yeah.
So
you can reject that together, the treatment. So
but I think when we look at multiple hypothesis testing, it's not robust.
Okay, but I just wanted to make sure that there was one benefit of formalization, and that seems to materialize as taking any treatment, not all of the treatments armed separately, but all the treatments together as IV for formalization, and seem to at least find one potential benefit that goes through a third party. And that may be there, so that may.
But we don't find anything on bank account, I think.
Sorry, yeah, loans contract.
On loans, but the results are a bit mixed, I think, because we find some impact on the first year, and like we have 2 years, and the first year we find some impact, and so we can talk later, but I don't see.
Yeah, but it seems it's raising it, like Michael took it to another level by saying, well, there's no benefit to formalization, it's just a cost. I think you can talk to this, like, maybe.
Thank you very much. I would like to build on the comments that Michael made. Apparently, it's still very attractive for informal entrepreneurs to remain in the informal sector. So I wonder if your survey also provides additional information on why they actually prefer to remain in the informal sector. So on the one hand, you have the process of formalization, where I think this intervention very much alludes to, but then also the status of being formal. So I don't know if your survey has more on that. So why do people actually do not want to formalize?
Okay, I didn't get the point when you did your heterogeneity analysis. Did you classify your firm according to their size or to their productivity? And if it's not about, you didn't classify them according to their productivity, for me, okay, I think maybe informal firm would have more incentive to be formalized when they reach a certain level of productivity. And they want to go further. They want to have access to some kind of contract they cannot have access while being informal firms. So that's my question.
Okay, I'm going to answer this question on why they remain informal. We did ask that at the Endline survey, and I think for a large majority of firms, they are seeing that they are too small to formalize. For them, it's some of them, they are not thinking they are firms. They are thinking that, oh, I just have this business. And so for a lot of them, it was like, okay, they think they are too small, so there is no point to become formal. And for some of them also, they also think that it will mean paying more taxes or more trouble with the administration. So it's a bit weird to see that they think that there is more, you will have more trouble with all administration when you become formal and not, actually showing your card of that you are formal, you expose you to paying more tax. So that was a perception. But what we see that it's in fact, firms that got the new status, they were able to pay less taxes. So yeah, I think these are the two important reasons. They don't see the point of becoming formal, and also they think that they don't want to pay more taxes. On the heterogeneity, yes, so the graph maybe I presented too quickly, but for the graph, what we did is we looked at baseline characteristics of both formal and informal firms. And we tried to use different characteristics like firm size, number of employees, whether they are paying tax or not, this type of characteristics to predict formality. And so to classify some firms as looking, some informal firms as looking like formal firms beforehand. And then when we look at this type of firms in our data at Endline, we see that they are actually much more likely to become formal. But we did also some heterogeneous analysis on other things like firm size, and we do see that the larger firms are more likely to become formal. We didn't look at productivity, so maybe that's something we can do, but yeah, we didn't look at that. And finally, on the bank accounts, bank loans, we didn't, and I think the number of firms that actually got the loans is not very high, you have to show me the table you're talking about, but I don't think we don't see much about that, and the fact that in the treatment groups, not a lot of firms were interested with the bank accounts. Also, it's with the official entrepreneur bank account that was supposed to be specially designed for them. This is also a signal that they are not very likely to be interested by that. Or also that if they were interested with a bank, they could get it by themselves without, and that formalization were not very helpful to help them get access to these benefits. Okay, any other question? Or? Okay, thanks a lot.